Is Brexit under threat from the machinations going on in the Labour Party as it looks to replace Keir Starmer? It's actually quite amusing to watch what's going on with David Lammy not being willing to commit to remaining outside the customs union. David Lammy thinking that if he takes a more pro-European stance, if he pushes a little bit further than collective responsibility strictly allows, he'll be popular with Labour members. He'll boost his chances in an upcoming leadership contest. Where Streeting, similarly, showing a little bit of leg on more left-wing subjects, pointing towards his affection for the European Union, and, of course, rowing back from his position on overdiagnosis of mental health illnesses to appeal to that lefty view of the world where all should have other people's money. But does this affect Brexit in line with the reset that Labour is proposing? Because what are they talking about? They're talking about following the EU's rules for phytosanitary regulations, so food production and the treatment of food as it goes through from the farm to the supermarket. And they're talking about adopting the carbon border adjustment mechanism in line with the European Union and following the EU's carbon pricing mechanisms. Now, all of these are a bad idea. What they do is they put costs up, they put more costs on the consumer, and they give us less freedom in terms of the agreements we have with other countries. So we have agreements with, I think, 72 other countries, none of which require us to adopt their rules for our own domestic production. They merely require us to meet the rules of the country we're exporting to. And this is all based on the idea that our trade with Europe has collapsed since we left the European Union, which simply isn't true. Overall trade, our trade with the world as a whole, has grown significantly. Mainly, it has to be said, because of services, not of manufactured goods. But that's not to do with Brexit, that's to do with our crazy energy policy, which has deindustrialised us, has meant that manufacturing companies have left, and our decision to destroy our car manufacturing company by 2030 by stopping it building petrol and diesel cars. So manufacturing has been hit by non-Brexit things, but our services have been growing like mad. One of the fastest growing has been services in relation to the law. Legal exports have been performing stunningly well. So the UK is able to trade at what it's good at and what it's competitive at outside the European Union. UK total exports, and this is from the wonderful Catherine McBride, who you should all follow and listen to on Substack and her other outlets, points out that UK total exports to all destinations are up by 25% in current prices since 2019. Exports to the EU by 20% since 2019, and goods exports, which has been our weakest, up by 2% in current prices. They've gone down in real terms, but that's because of things that were re-exports that never really were UK goods in the first place, but under EU rules, if they came into us and went out again, they counted as UK exports to the EU. So that includes things like tropical fruits and clothing and footwear that were produced in the Far East and sent on to the EU. Of course, they've gone out of it. We never produced those things in the first place, and therefore they don't count as our exports. And our chemicals and petrochemicals exports have gone down. Why? Because we have mad green policies that make it harder to extract from the North Sea and have made it too costly to produce chemicals in this country. So the trade position does not need this reset at all, and the overall position doesn't need a reset because we're saving £25 billion a year at least from not being a member of the European Union. That's cash. And we're saving billions, probably into the hundreds of billions, by not taking on the contingent liabilities of the EU, which is debt the EU has been taking on for things like dealing with COVID. So we've avoided new contingent liabilities, we're paying in less cash, we are trading more with the rest of the world, we have the Brexit freedoms, and we have the ability to deregulate. We have AI, where we are leading in Europe. Why? Because Europe's crushed it with regulation that we're outside, and we're doing little but important things like gene editing, which will help our agricultural sector. So the idea that Brexit needs a reset is wrong, is a fundamental error. It also, of course, it's always worth thinking about this, has given us this fundamental democratic right that we now make our own laws. And if there's a law you don't like, blame the government. You can't blame Europe anymore. We no longer have that farce of ministers going off to the EU and saying, oh, all right then, abstaining in the council and then coming back and saying it's the beastly EU that has imposed this on us. We have proper democratic accountability. Any law you don't like, blame the government, not some foreign body. So, there's no need for a reset. But is it really an attempt to reverse Brexit, or is it merely noise around a potential Labour Party leadership contest? Now, I think that Labour would obviously like to go back into the EU, but it knows it couldn't do that without another referendum. And having seen the last referendum, it's not going to do that. Why? Well, the first reason is that unpopular governments lose referendums, that the unpopularity of the government would overtake whatever people thought about any particular subject. It is too high a risk for an unpopular government to have a referendum. At this point, the government is stunningly unpopular so early in its period in office. I don't think it could win a referendum to name the days of the week as they currently are. If it said that Sunday should still be called Sunday, it's so unpopular it would lose the referendum. People would say, no, there's another name for it. Perhaps we should find one from the mists of time. So they won't have the referendum to reverse Brexit properly. I also think that even if they thought they could win it, they would be very nervous about the divisiveness that the last referendum caused and repeating that. So I think there are two reasons. One, they would lose. The second, referendums are very problematic and they take a lot of time away from actual governing. So I don't think they want one. I think the second referendum argument has essentially gone and will not come back in the near term. So what they want to do instead is rejoin by stealth. So cozy up to the customs union without formally joining it, cozy up to the single market without formally joining it. But this is where the real Brexit benefit comes, because there is a huge legal difference between being part of the European Union and having its law as our law and our judges imposing its law than there is from being somebody who is linked to them and following them but without being part of their formal legal structure. What is the big difference? It's reversible. It's back to a traditional constitutional position that Parliament cannot bind its successors. One of the big constitutional problems with the EU was it effectively meant that the 1970 to 74 Parliament had bound its successors, that the 1972 European Communities Act made European law senior law, where as long as we remember, we couldn't override it without being in contempt of European law, and actually in our own terms, as long as that act remained, acting illegally in domestic law as well as ignoring international law. Hungary is being fined €1 million a day for ignoring EU law in terms of migration policy. So you can have a great row, but there are consequences for it. It's like you can break the speed limit, but you risk being fined. The law is the law. Now that simply isn't the case. We can have an agreement with the EU to do things that I think are a bad idea. And I think joining the customs union is a terrible idea. Makes goods more expensive for British consumers, makes it harder to do other trade deals, potentially invalidates our existing trade deals. I think the single market is even worse. The single market is a regulatory trap that makes us less efficient, makes British industry less competitive and prices higher. So I think these are terrible policies, really bad for the economy in the short term, increasingly bad in the long term. I also think it would be tying us in to a failing European approach. I think the liberal internationalist approach of the EU, the anti-democratic approach of the EU is clearly failing. They're not dealing with the demographic problems, they're not dealing with the migration problems, and their green policies are strangling economic growth. So I think the EU model doesn't work anymore anyway, and therefore to want to join it is economically illiterate. But if this government does it, we don't have to worry about Brexit itself, because a new government could change it. And the worse this government is, the higher the chance of a new government changing it, and the higher the chance of people feeling this is so uncomfortable that we need a really big change, a fundamental change, as we had in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher came in, rather than tinkering at the edges. You see, political change comes when the country is ready for it. Political change comes when you're going with the grain of public opinion. I can have ideas that could make this country the richest country in the world, but if the people, the voters, aren't ready for it, don't want it, it will never happen. Good ideas have to come at the right time. It's how Margaret Thatcher succeeded and why Ted Heath didn't. He had some radical ideas, Selsdon Man and all of that. But in 1970, the country wasn't ready for it. After the disasters of the Labour government, 74 to 79, the country was ready for it. And that's the position I think we're getting to now, that we want that radical change that will make us richer, but will have consequences. Changing things has consequences. It makes things harder for some people whilst you cut through the bracken to get to a better situation, the broad sunlit uplands. But when you're cutting back bracken, the bracken doesn't like it. And that will be the challenge of 2029. But we are safeguarded by being out. We are legally an independent nation. So Keir Starmer can agree to a customs union, he can agree to single market, he can change his name to Ursula von der Leyen for all I care, because we can change the lot of it if we can win an election. And the grandstanding of senior Labour ministers is actually quite funny to watch. Seeing it from the other side, from the outside, I know what they're doing. David Lammy for Prime Minister, he must be in cloud cuckoo land, but that's why he's gazing up to the customs union. He's flying a kite. He's trying to persuade the left that he's their man after all. Well, if David Lammy succeeds Keir Starmer, I'm a Dutchman, a good European in that sense, but I don't think I will be. Excuse my sneeze, and thank you for watching.